Welcome to the show, Dennis. This is Dennis Francis, folks. Fantastic author, contributor, marketer, and we're going to talk to Dennis a little bit today about a project he's working on called Street Wolf. Welcome to the show, Dennis.
Hi, Chris. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. So, what's the backstory to Street Wolf? What's the product? What is it about?
Well, this is a graphic novel. Essentially, back in the mid 80s, I worked as a comic book artist. Well, for about 10 years at that time, I worked as a comic book artist for DC Comics, did some work for Marvel and some of the independents. A writer by the name of Mark Wayne Harris wanted to do a project that was a bit controversial. He had gotten the company Blackthorn Publishing, based in the West Coast, to greenlight the project. He wanted to do a mini series about a Native American Avenger, sort of a superhero without the spandex and the cape. So essentially, he wanted to do an inner city character who helped the police to fight crime. This was at a time when a lot of the comic book characters started going dark. They started shooting people. The idea of good and evil was blurred. And he wanted to get back to the essential aspects of heroism. He wanted to go to a point where an ordinary guy would step in and fight crime, help the police without having the accoutrements of fantastic weapons or what have you. He did this in a way that was controversial in the sense that he hit on topics that comic books at the time weren't supposed to.
No, I was just going to say. So like what?
He looked at areas like drug addiction. He did an extensive study of international child prostitution and child trafficking. He looked at the time, the gang scene, how drugs and gangs were interwoven in the inner cities. He even looked at a topic which I thought was creepy, necrophilia.
Yeah,
And
that's pretty creepy.
yeah, I said to him, "Well, how are you going to do this?" And he said, "Well, the publisher gave me carte blanche to put together a project. He showed me all the information. I sat there, I read through this stuff and creeped me out. But he actually he pulled it off. Here was a character who had a dark side of his own. His family, very similar to Bruce Wayne, Batman. His family was killed with a twist. His mother was murdered by his father, who then committed suicide. This happened while he was a kid, and it happened in front of him. So you're talking about a guy with PTSD who turns his life into a mission to help other people because of what he was dealing with. And so we kind of explore his dark side, but focus on his heroic side. But the twist was you couldn't tell whether there's going to be a happy ending to each story.
It wasn't kind of a plastic carbon copy animated series kind of a thing.
No, this was definitely for adults. I mean, you didn't have any of there weren't really any blood and guts, but the story, the content, the characters, everything had a mature feel to it. I mean, you had cops who they weren't on the take, but they didn't turn the blind eye to shooting someone if they thought it was justice.
Yeah.
Now, he felt that this was wrong because, you know, he was about law and order, but they they weren't black and white. They were gray. He was looking for a black and white. He was looking for good versus evil. He was looking for a sane world where you could tell the difference. But unfortunately, our world is not that way.
I mean, that brings a lot of things to the table because I don't know if the audience necessarily knows this, but one of the biggest areas of publishing growth in the last, maybe as much as a decade, but certainly the last 5 years, has been this graphic novel outpouring. And you'll find them in every bookstore. A lot of the Japanese graphic novels, a lot of the North American graphic novels are that they've grown into major motion picture series. They've grown into a lot of popular culture, everything from V for Vendetta Underworld, all that kind of stuff, the big vampire movement, if you will. A lot of that stems from a lot of the graphic novels that came out. That's an adult-oriented marketplace that is matured, and I think this is a series that goes into that subject matter, right?
Yeah, part of what has happened over several decades is the comic book market has grown up. Part of that, as you mentioned, had to do with movement of Japanese comics called manga into our pop culture. The Japanese are heavily influenced by comics, and coincidentally, they got their comic influences from the U.S. soldiers who brought comics over in World War II,
Ah,
and by Disney. So they got an American institution, which is what comics was back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. That influenced their pop culture, and then in the 90s, that culture came back to us, and we saw a lot of the readers, a lot of young readers, saw manga and anime, the animation component of that, as a new and interesting thing. And so you look at most of the kids right now and you say anime or manga, and their eyes light up.
yeah.
You know, you say superhero comics, and they're like, yeah, okay. They know Superman, they know Batman, etc. So there was a heavy influence of manga on our culture, which then made bookstores sit up and take notice because all this stuff was selling. And the American comics then said, well, we can compile our books into graphic novel compilations, sell them in bookstores. And then the movie industry said, hey, we like this stuff. We can churn out popular movies based on something that's already popular. And you know, the movie industry, they really don't like originality.
Yeah.
So that's where we saw this steady progression in growth between graphic novels and Japanese influenced print media, and the rise in movie content based on graphic novels. I mean, you have Road to Perdition starring Tom Hanks, which became a big hit and a critical hit as well as a popular movie based on a graphic novel. And you wouldn't think of that as, you know, spandex and capes.
Yeah.
And so there's the medium itself is not necessarily, you know, the genre, and that's why we've seen over the last couple of decades really good movies, really strong movies come out of that graphic novel medium.
And one of the points that you're making about the Street Wolf character and the stuff that you're talking about is the fact that you're addressing not the same kind of storylines that you'd find in a typical kind of upbeat thing. You're finding storylines that are pretty serious. But when we were talking about it a little earlier, you'd mentioned something about the feedback you got from the original release of Street Wolf. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact that had.
Yeah, that floored me. I was a young artist, and I had worked for DC Comics. I worked for a lot of the merchandising and as well as comic strips back then. But I never received the kind of feedback from readers as I did when we did the Street Wolf project. One of the issues that we did dealt with child prostitution and molestation. And one that we did dealt with street crime and drugs. I had letters from people in the army, people in the armed forces. I had letters from young people, teenagers, and in their 20s, who wrote me saying, "This is the story about my sister, or this is the story about me. This is what happened in my life," and it floored me because we're in the business of writing fantasy. We're in the business of writing stuff from our imaginations. And when people who've actually experienced these things come back and tell us this is our story, it hits you in the gut. And it also kind of makes you feel, wow, we were able to offer either a catharsis or offer a perspective on this to someone that we wouldn't even consider ourselves.
I mean that's a big deal, and I've had similar sorts of things with movies. the last while in particular. As you get older, you have more experiences accumulated. Some are awesome and some not so much. And as some of these movies come out, especially the ones that involve suicide or whatnot of one of the key characters, and they portray that suicide on the film. And I use the example of Dead Poet Society. Amazing, amazing movie. Every time I see that movie, I'm great right up to the point that the kid is about to commit suicide. And at that point, because there was suicide in my family, I'm in trouble.
Right.
I'm not ready to handle the rest of that movie.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that reaction that you get from some of those things that are so, it's palpable. You feel it in your skin, your blood, your bone. You feel that reaction. And some of it is, as you say, very cathartic. Some of it is very scary, and there's a responsibility that goes with it. But by giving it sort of an opportunity for a discussion and a hero to talk about it in a way that you can put a perspective on it instead of making it a punchline in a video game or something.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more, this is my thoughts, but I think there's a lot more that the audience gets out of it when you have that perspective rather than the punchline bit.
Yeah. Well, I had someone tell me that they were able to deal with the situation in the third person. And I didn't quite understand, but when I went back and looked at one of the episodes, I kind of figured it out. What happened was they're able to see something that they experienced from a different vantage point. So they're able to go through that experience without feeling the same visceral feeling that they did before. And in that particular case, the perpetrator found his end. In the case of the person who wrote to me, they never found the perpetrator.
Yeah.
And in some small way, they felt some kind of vindication, or they felt a way of stepping outside of that situation and dealing with it, even though they never saw an ultimate resolution to the situation.
They still got some sort of semi-closure.
Yeah. And in a way, they went through the experience without having to go through the visceralness of the experience. And it felt different to them, but it was strong enough that they actually wrote to me about it. And I thought that was amazing.
That's very cool.
Yeah. Now, the current book was a short proposal written by Mark Wayne Harris, who is in New Jersey. He's the co-creator. He sent me an 8-page script, just a synopsis. He wanted to get back into writing. And I looked at it, and he wrote a scene about a young woman who was captive, and he ended the scene in such I'm not going to go into it too much. It still kind of gives me the creeps. But he ended that scene, and I said, I must do this. And he said, well, I just thought you'd like to see it. It's just a test. And then he ended with, however, I am too busy to do this project. And if I could have reached into the phone lines and strangled him, I would have. Yeah. So I said to him, look, I'm going to take this over. I'm going to publish it. I'm going to get it done. And he goes, that's fine. Right now, I'm just swamped. I've got stuff, but I had to get this little thing out of me. And he got it out and handed it to me. And I was just like holding a baby and going, what am I going to do with this thing?
Yeah, exactly.
And that ended up being an 80-page graphic novel. And it was just one of those things. Basically, what happens is a young woman is missing. And Nathan Blackhorse, who is Street Wolf, that's his moniker on the street. Nathan Blackhorse is tasked by his cousin to find this young girl. Now, one of the things that we don't seem to understand in this country is exactly how many people are missing every day in this country. And we see the quote, the missing blonde syndrome constantly, where, and this is not to take away from the fact that someone's someone's a loved one is missing, but the vast majority of people who never are found are not young and blonde and female. And so the story goes into what happens when a young Russian woman goes missing, and her family's, basically in the slums. No one really cares. The police is basically overwhelmed, and there's a gang war going on. So they have that much, that less amount of resources to deal with something like a missing teenager. And so he takes up the case, and the story is about what happens throughout the process and how he realizes at some point in the story, I'm dealing with more than just a runaway. And when the bodies pile up and when things happen, and he has to enlist both criminals in the system and cops in the system to help find this girl. And unfortunately, he finds more than just a little runaway situation. And that's where the story gets really crazy.
And you're right. It's a pandemic in the U.S. And in Canada that is grossly underreported. There's a group of people here in Phoenix, in particular, who have a charity that they support, and I'm sorry, I forget the exact name of the charity, but it's to rehab women who have finally escaped from the sex slave industry, where they were abducted as children and used as sex slaves and sex workers for a decade and a half, what have you. These people, once they find those women and are able to get them out and free them and return them to society, of course, that the women are broken in so many different ways.
Yeah.
So this organization works with them to rehabilitate them mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, get them back to being human.
Yeah.
After decades of effectively PTSD, or trauma, rather. The PTSD comes afterwards.
Yeah.
And they were talking about the stats, and they actually got a program together that's available on, forget what channel, but they play it periodically on something like a PBS type scenario, but it's only played after midnight.
Right.
So the number of parents who get to see it are very few.
Right.
Because most of us are in bed because we have our kids and we're up early.
Right.
Well, the challenge with that, of course, is that the whole point is for the average parent to see it.
Yeah.
Because the numbers are shocking. I think a few weeks ago I saw a recent update. It's something like 330,000 kids a year go missing.
Yeah.
In the U.S.
On an average, every day there's 2,300 Americans missing every day. This is every day.
Yeah. And a significant, I forget what, but it's over 50% are never found.
Yeah. And I mean, in the case of the story that we wrote, the girl she's Asian Russian. So I mean, she's basically a minority within a minority. And she's from one of the Russian states, and minorities account for 65% of non-family abductions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, non-family abduction basically means, your aunt or your uncle or your father didn't take you away from, the in-laws or something. So essentially, there are a lot of people falling through the cracks in the system that are never, ever accounted for in the media.
And it's a colossal volume of people. My wife and I talk about it fairly regularly because, of course, we have our 6-month-old daughter, and we're looking at it from the point of view of how do you overprotect? You don't cocoon them, but how do you keep them from hazard?
Yeah.
And it's a challenge. It's something that some parents are paying a lot of attention to, some too much, a lot too little. And it's a rough subject, but it's a subject that you've treated well in a graphic novel so that people can kind of get an idea of it without being, as you say, kind of overwhelmed.
Yeah. And As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that Mark Wayne Harris brought to the Street Wolf stories is you don't always know if there's going to be a happy ending. Sometimes you can get both in the same story, depending on the plot lines. But it's real. It's life. It's real in terms of how these things turn out, and we never know. Well, I did in this particular story, but the readers never know up to the end who's going to make it and who isn't. And that's just part of life, and it's reflected in the storylines.
So that's a lot of interesting stuff that goes it's not what we'd call the old candy cane comic book.
Yeah.
So for a lot of the adult listeners that are listening to this show, you may find a lot of interesting kind of mystery sleuth subject matter here that's not just your typical candy coated stuff.
Now the title of it, if you go to Amazon.com, you'll find the book. It's titled Mute Elation, a Street Wolf graphic novel. Our comic projects can be seen at graphic-novels.com. We do commentary, we do reviews, we have interviews, and lots of news on comics and graphic novels can be found there. And my publication company is DID Publishing, and I can be found at didpublishing.com.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. Great conversation and a really interesting subject. Can't wait to kind of get my hands on the next one.
Or you can pick one up at Amazon.
Sounds good, sir. This is Dennis Francis and the Street Wolf Project, available on Amazon today.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate your help, Chris.
You're very welcome.